And now, Daljit Dhaliwal.
Many thought the days of military coups were finally over for Latin America. Events in Honduras proved otherwise when President Manuel Zelaya was recently ousted by his military. For some insight into the coup and its aftermath, we are joined by Kevin Casas Zamora of the Brookings Institution. Welcome to Foreign Exchange.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about what led some Hondurans to force President Zelaya out of the country at gunpoint.
It's a very murky situation. What we have here is, number one, a president elected by the people who was trying to engineer his re-election through blatantly unconstitutional means. He was told as much by the Honduran Supreme Court. He kept at it. And at some point, just before...
Didn't he say that he was testing public opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that's his line to explain what he was trying to do. He was trying to organize some kind of unsanctioned popular consultation, which in practical terms was a referendum, a non-binding referendum. And at some point, he ordered the military to help him organize this popular consultation. The military refused because they thought that the order was unconstitutional. So he dismissed the military commander, and the military commander was reinstated by the Supreme Court. So a classic case of a conflict between branches of government.
Right.
And at some point, the Honduran military decided to solve the problem of the illegal referendum through an illegal military intervention.
It's being referred to as a coup. Is that the correct way of looking at it, do you think?
By all means, it is a coup.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the mediation efforts in Costa Rica. You are the former vice president of Costa Rica. Can you give us some insight into why those negotiations, those efforts at mediation have stalled?
Well, because it's a very difficult situation. Both leaders, Zelaya and the current head of the government, Roberto Micheletti, seem to be not only hell-bent on his positions, but also it seems to me that they seem to be negotiating from deeply unrealistic positions. In the case of President Zelaya, he doesn't seem to understand that if he is to return to the presidency in Honduras, as the international community is demanding, and it is the correct thing to do, there will have to be some concessions on his part. If anything, Dalit, because the country was not governable when he was in power and is not governable now. And his return in and of itself won't solve anything. So the conditions for to make Honduras governable have to be created. And this means that President Zelaya would have to give up on his efforts to amend the Constitution, number one. Very likely he would have to put some distance between his government and Hugo Chavez, and President Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, which is very much at the root of this whole problem. And very likely there would have to be some kind of amnesty that sadly turns a blind eye on the legal behavior of all the parties involved. So that kind of creates a set of conditions that allow Zelaya to return to the country in conditions that he will be able at least to finish his term.
Right. Well, what is the connection between Zelaya and Chavez? I mean, aren't there, what he's done is reminiscent of what Hugo Chavez did in terms of trying to prolong his rule, but politically and ideologically, I mean, didn't they at least start off at kind of opposite poles? In Honduras, the president was very pro-business, whereas you can't say the same of Chavez. What's happened? What's narrowed the differences?
Actually, much has been made of the notion that there's an ideological conflict here and that the Honduran elite was up in arms against the social policies enacted by President Zelaya. I think this is far less ideological than people make it out to be. what is truly crucial to understand here is that a part of the elite in Honduras is really frightened to death of the closeness between President Zelaya and President Chavez. So it's less about the policies than about the perceived closeness between these two men.
So fear, to a large extent, fear of what they thought might happen.
Exactly.
Was partly behind this coup. I mean,
Exactly.
they removed
Exactly.
a democratically elected president because they thought he could do a Chavez on them.
To a large extent, it's less about what has happened than about what might happen.
How did Hugo Chavez use this to his advantage? And I mean, he sought to make political capital out of it, especially with the Obama administration. Do you think that he was successful?
I don't think so, because the reaction of the U.S. administration and the way the U.S. administration has been handling this has been very good. You know, at the first moment, the U.S. administration came out very strongly against the coup, which is very important in itself. I mean, bear in mind that there's a long history of U.S. meddling in Latin American political affairs, not always on the side of democracy, as we all know. So giving that sort of message to the region was truly crucial. And then, when it became obvious that the mediation efforts by the OAS were not successful, Secretary Clinton sort of stepped in and put her weight and the weight of the Obama administration and the weight of the U.S. behind some kind of negotiated settlement. And that's when President Arias and the Costa Rican connection came in. And even when Secretary Clinton did that, she was careful enough to hand over the dialogue process to regional actors, which was the right thing to do.
Leave us with your thoughts on how you think that this crisis is going to be resolved. How can it be resolved?
It's very difficult to give a straight answer to that, because at this point, with the possibility of success looking increasingly likely at the political dialogue in Costa Rica, you don't see a clear way out. Actually, my hunch is that, sadly, unfortunately, this might well turn out to be a case of that old saying that problems never get solved, they get replaced by new ones. And that both Honduras and the world just move on and forget about the whole thing. And Honduras, sadly, after all this, goes back to the obscurity it came from. I mean, that would be tragic, but it's very likely. It might yet happen.
All right. Well, it's a story that we're certainly going to continue to watch. And thank you very much
My
for
pleasure.
your insights.